He's trying, isn't he?
Yeah.
There we go. It's because it's cold out.
Right.
When it's cold, they don't, you gotta kind of ask them nicely.
Right.
So, when Ford was designing Model Ts and Model A cars, generally their cars were always black. But this car and your Hugsters and your wagons were allowed to be the sandy color.
Oh.
So this is a museum quality car that you guys are riding in. It's all original. Like I said, it's a 6-volt. Now it does have the crank to where you could crank in the front, but that's very dangerous to do. So most of them have been converted to an electric start,
Yeah.
so that you don't break your thumb or your forearm.
Right.
But if I wanted to, I could still use the crank. And they also can run on whiskey. So during Prohibition, if you ran out of regular gas, you can actually run them on whiskey. Okay, here we go. And in the 20s, they didn't have power steering. So by the end of the season, I'll be able to bench press a Volkswagen. So, do you guys want to hear the history of all of Fredericksburg?
Yeah, sounds great.
All right, let's get going here then. Back in 1728, Fredericksburg was founded. Now, King George II was the King of England at the time, and he had a son named Frederick, and that's how Fredericksburg was founded and named. It was named after the king's son. Now, you may ask, well, where did the burg come from? And that's because the King of England was actually German. And, you know, King George was a bit of a tyrant, and this is his street right here. Now, the street that we're on is named Caroline Street. So a lot of the street that's named after the Queen. A lot of the streets in the historical district are named after the royal family. Now, Caroline Street, the street that we're on right now, is where your major shopping is at, your dining, your antique shops, also art galleries. We're very much an art community. They have what's called First Friday. And the first Friday of every month is dedicated to the arts from 5 o'clock until 8 o'clock at night. And the shops will open up their doors, you'll have hors d'oeuvres. It's like one great big art opening. And you'll have musicians and things like that. So it's really a lot of fun to come to Fredericksburg on the first Friday of every month. Now, there have been a lot of really important people that have walked down this street. People like Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Benjamin Franklin, Sacagawea, Pocahontas, even John Smith. All of those historical figures have been in and around Fredericksburg. Not to mention, Frederick, the Prince himself, has walked here in the colonies and in Fredericksburg. There's also living museums on Caroline Street. Also, there will be a lot of living museums on this tour, and I will point them out as we kind of chug along. Coming up on my left, right after the church here, we have our first living museum where this flag is at. This is the Hugh Mercer Apothecary Shop. Now, Hugh Mercer was a war refugee from Scotland, and he was fighting in the French and Indian War, and that is where he met George Washington. When those two met, they became very good friends. They actually had this uncanny likeness. They were both 6'4", and they both had flaming red hair. People don't realize that George was a redhead. Now, you know, you always got to have that one rich friend, and they did. And his name was Fielding Lewis. And on my left, he owned this mercantile building here, the Lewis Store, which is a museum, but not a living museum. Now, this is considered the oldest commercial Charlestown, West Virginia after him.
Oh, wow.
So when he moved out, that's when they made it a proper tavern. And the difference between a proper tavern and a regular tavern is a proper tavern guaranteed you wouldn't have more than 5 people ahead of you in your bath water. Let that sink in for a minute. I wouldn't fare well at all. And guess where they got their water, guys? Right down here in the Rappahannock River. Look at how low our river is.
Oh, wow, it is low.
Yeah, we've just not had good rain all year. You never see sandbars like that. Now, the Rappahannock River is named after the Rappahannock Indians, and it means in their language alternating current or tide. Now, across the river, we have Chatham Manor, which is that structure across the way. Now, this is Park and Rec headquarters, but during the Civil War, that was Union headquarters. So you had General Burnside on that side and General Lee on this side. Now, those two went to military school together, and they were friends until the Civil War.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did not know that.
I know. Now, here on my left is the original Mary Washington Hospital. We kind of buzzed by this a little fast because we don't want any spooks jumping in the back of the car. Because this is the most haunted structure in all of Fredericksburg, being that it used to be a hospital and they had the crematorium right next door. You know, people actually live in the crematorium.
Really?
I'm like, have you guys never watched a horror movie ever?
Yeah.
That's like horror movie 101. Living in a crematorium is probably not a good idea. Now here we have our blue and our yellowish colored house. This is a perfect example of colonial houses. Now these have been added on to, but they were taxed on road frontage, so the people made the houses long. That's why they're so long. You get the term shotgun houses from that.
Oh.
Yeah. Now, right ahead of us on the left is a house. Now, this is called the Gordon House. Now, this is private. It's not a museum. But it's where our first millionaires lived. The Gordons were millionaires. Now, they were brothers, and they were lawyers. A lot of people don't know this, but Mary Washington, George Washington's mom, was actually an orphan, and she was raised by the Gordon family.
Oh.
Now, this is in the 18th century, okay, and women didn't generally have rights back then. But because it was such an educated family, and a family educated in the law, Mary Washington learned about the law. So when Augustine Washington passed away, when George Washington was just 11 years old, Mary didn't remarry. And that's because she knew that if she did, Ferry Farm, George's childhood home, will go to the new husband or the new husband's family, not to mention all of her belongings. So she said, you know, I don't feel comfortable doing that. I think I can raise these 9 kids on my own, which she did do, and I can tend to the farm on my own. Now, this is colonial times, so generally the farms were cash crops, and what was the most popular crop? Tobacco. So the first mother of our country, this can only happen in America, was a tobacco farmer.
Right.
It's a good thing the tobacco industry didn't do their research and learn their history. Otherwise, we would have saw pictures of Mary Washington on those lucky cigarette packages, or Newport, or whatever the brand names are. Marlboro. Instead of the Marlboro man, maybe they would have had a picture of Mary Washington. But that didn't happen because they didn't do their research. Now, coming up here on my left behind this brick wall is another living museum. It's one of my favorites. You guys only have time to go into one museum. This is the one that I recommend. This is called Kenmore. Now, I'm going to get you a good view up here. If you look between this gate, you can see the front. Oh, they have the gate open today. Generally,
oh, wow.
Look at the front of that. Now, remember I pointed out the rich friend, Fielding Lewis? Well, his wife died in childbirth. And he was, you know, quite a bit older than the Washingtons. And he was quite a bit wealthy, too. And he went to George and said, hey, George, I'd like to marry Betty Washington, which was George Washington's younger sister. And George was very excited, and because he was wealthy and of good status. He was just basically a really good guy. It's just that he was quite a bit her senior. So he approached Betty and said, hey, Betty, Fielding would like to marry you. Betty said, well, I'm not marrying that old goat. So George had to go back to Fielding and say, hey, you've got to do something. She's not going to marry you. Fielding's like, door for her to woo her. And this is where they spent the rest of their lives together.
Oh.
Yeah. And that is a living museum. And he spared no expense. Now we're coming into my favorite neighborhood, the Victorian neighborhood. Now you know you're in a proper Victorian neighborhood because one, you get the introduction of landscaping and big elaborate front porches. You also have a grassy knoll or a courtyard because this is where your courting took place.
Oh.
Right? And they also did a lot of entertainment. This house here on my right just came on the market a few weeks ago. They're asking $3 million for that house.
Wow.
Yeah. These houses are very expensive. They're all very historical. 1411 here is my favorite. Look at that front porch. But it's not just because it's beautiful, but because it's said that when Benjamin Franklin would come and visit Fredericksburg, that he would stay in that house. Now, coming up here on my right is the Mary Washington Monument, which is what you see. Mary Washington is actually buried here. Now, a lot of tour guides spend a lot of time talking about the monument, which I will talk about the monument. But to me, the most important thing is the tree. Okay, you see this white oak tree?
Yeah.
White oak trees can live forever. Now, when Mary passed, Fredericksburg didn't have a headstone for her because they planned on building a monument. But Fredericksburg was broke after all the wars, right? So the Gordon family, because that's their cemetery behind the monument there, planted that oak tree in 1789 when Mary died. Now, historians say that they don't know where Mary's buried.
Right.
Well, Katrina does. She's buried by that tree. Because there's a rock by there's a rock parked by that tree, and it's called Meditation Rock. Because Mary would come down here every morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, sit on that rock and pray for her children.
Yeah.
Especially George, because he was 6'4" and had red hair and fighting in a battle. He's a bit of a target. And so it makes sense to me that that's where she is buried.
Right.
Now, there was a woman named Mary that lived here in Fredericksburg. She didn't like the idea that that monument hadn't been built yet. So she created a fund and a campaign to write to other women named Mary across the colonies of the United States to ask for donations to, pay for that monument, which it was successful because that's what you see is that monument. That was 100 years after the death of Mary. First time in history that a monument has been erected for a woman and paid for by women. Now here we have the Hugh Mercer statue. He was a handsome fella. I would have dated him. Now, whenever you see a statue like that and their weapon is drawn and pointed down, it means that they died in battle. Now, Hugh died in the Battle of Princeton. He was just merely 35 years old when he was stabbed 3 times by the British Army. Now, the British thought that they had George Washington. Remember I said they looked a lot alike?
Yeah.
Well, they sent out messengers to state, we won the war, we won the war. So for a brief time in history, the British thought that they won the Revolutionary War. Now, this was a long war, took about 9 days. When at the end of the war, like they traditionally did, they went around and they were thunking people over the head to make sure that they were dead. Well, they came across Hugh, they thunked him over the head. Well, as only a Scotsman can do, he screamed out in a Scottish accent, until the death. Well, then those soldiers went, "Duel! We just sent out messengers stating we won the war because we thought we killed George Washington. We did not, we killed you." So now we got to draw sticks on who's going to go and tell the king, whoops, we made a mistake. We didn't kill George Washington. We actually killed Hugh Mercer. We didn't win the war. So there's the saying, I drew the short end of the stick.
Yeah.
That's where that saying comes from.
Oh.
Yeah, a lot of sayings came from the colonial period that we still hold on to today, which I think is quite fascinating. Now, this whole area that we've been driving around in is part of a 40-block historical district that is on the National Register for Historic Places. We're considered one of the more intact cities. Coming up here, this structure that's all white, this is actually the Mary Washington House. This is a living museum. This is where Mary Washington lived the last 17 years of her life. She actually died in this house.
Oh.
Now they say she died of breast cancer, and that's why there's so many pink ribbons on the fences there.
Oh.
She died at the age of 81 years old. That's quite impressive for anybody in the 18th century, but especially a woman. Most women died in childbirth. And remember, we didn't have antibiotics. So, you know, a common infection could kill you. I would have been a dead duck from the get-go. I think about all the antibiotics I've been on in my life. All those things would have killed me back during that time. So I'm very grateful to be in this century. Now, one thing too is if you notice on the other side of that black door, you'll see an oval plaque that says 1824. In the historical district, you'll see those plaques on the sides of doors. That tells you the date that the building was built, and then in little letters underneath it, it'll tell you who it was that built it or lived there.
Okay.
It's kind of fun to see, you know, these buildings and how old they are. Now, those are on homes and also commercial buildings. Now we're approaching William Street, named after the prince. This is what I call the second heart of Fredericksburg, because this is where all your dining is at and your nightlife. So we have Castiglia's, which is an Italian restaurant. I think they have one of the coolest, you know, balconies. And then here on my right is Cool Cat Cupcakes. If you see people walking around downtown with cupcakes, this is generally where they got them from.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Everybody says they're really good. I don't want to try one because I know it'll be good, and then I'll be craving them all the time, and I'll be the size of a hippopotamus.
Right.
So I better stay away. I made the mistake of eating chocolate cake at Bello Monzo's, and now I crave that stupid chocolate cake all the time. It is absolutely delicious, though. And I'm very picky about my chocolate stuff, you know, 'cause sometimes it tastes flat. No, there's stuff that's really good. And I'll point out Bello Monzo's when we get back. Now we're coming up to, on my right, another living museum. This is the James Monroe Museum. This is a living one. And as we go by, you'll see a Civil War cannon still lodged in the side of the building. You see that?
The cannonball.
Yeah, don't touch it. Yep, you'll see those periodically throughout Fredericksburg in some of our buildings. Now, James Monroe was our 5th president, not to be confused with James Madison. James Monroe, good president. James Madison was the one in charge of the Trail of Tears. So he has a bit of a bad reputation. James Monroe believed that if you were in public service, you shouldn't get paid. So he gave his money away. And people say, well, where did he give his money to? Well, he gave it to the free slaves so that they could reunite with their families.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, he died penniless, actually. Now here on my right is the oldest cemetery in the United States. This is the Masonic Cemetery, so a lot of our Masons are buried there. Now we're coming up to a couple churches. On my left, you'll see a steeple. That's a copper steeple. That is our Episcopalian church, and this is where George Washington and his family went to church. There's actually 5 stained glass windows in that church that were donated by Tiffany's. Here on my right is our Presbyterian church. They're doing a little bit of construction. Now, this church was used as a hospital during the Civil War. Now, they had so many wounded that they had to take out the pews and use them as stretchers. And you know, you gotta recycle, so they went ahead and made them into coffins after they got done using them as stretchers. Then they took the bell out of the tower and they melted that down and made cannonballs, much like the one that you saw lodged in the James Monroe Museum. Well, all I can say is that if I was a soldier and I got hit by a cannonball made out of a church bell, I think God and I are gonna have a conversation, a long one. Right? Now this is Princess Anne Street. This is where our municipalities are at. Like our city hall, this is our new courthouse. This is relatively new. And there are 2 laws that are on the books today. And one of them is one of the reasons why you don't pay until the end of the ride, okay?
Yeah.
First law is, all right guys, we can't build wooden chimneys anymore because we're really tired of Fredericksburg catching on fire. So no more wooden chimneys. Then the next law is my favorite. It's the swine law. It's what it is, all right, guys, you can't just let your pigs run willy-nilly in the middle of the street. You got 3 days to pick them up. If you don't pick them up, we're going to pick them up, slaughter them, and feed them to the poor.
Yeah.
So I tell my riders, if you guys grab the little Piggly Wiggly and you put them in the back of the car, this ride's on me. That's how much I believe in that law. And you almost spoiled that by wanting to pay ahead of time. You guys could have got a free ride if you saw a pig. All right, if you just remember